Hello, everybody. I'm Danny Warshay. I'm the Executive Director of the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship, and I am so excited to welcome you all here today. First order of business is to reveal the answer to the poll, and I think I should say that we would encourage everybody to do all the above. But the answer to the poll, the thing you can do that will have the most impact on the environment is to eat a plant-based diet. And so I have right here my cashew butter and jelly sandwich that I thought was appropriate for this particular kind of emphasis. And I hope you'll all join me in being a adherent to a plant-based diet because it's good for you, and it's really good for the planet. So if you didn't know that, I hope you've at least learned one thing today because that's really important. I am going to just kick this off with a number of quick thank yous. We have limited time, so I'd like to make sure you spend most of it with Wendy and our panelists. But most of all, I wanted to send a number of thank yous. The first thank you is to all of you. It turns out we've had over 250 people register for this event, which makes it one of the Nelson Center's biggest events in its 4.5-year history, and that's appropriate. And many of you are tuning in from all over the world. Here's a subset of the countries represented: Argentina, Brazil, Japan, Ghana, Switzerland, Kenya, Korea, Singapore, Australia, Italy, Nicaragua, Germany, India, the UK, China, Canada, and of course the US. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because the topic that this panel is focused on affects every single person in the world. And it's fitting, I think, that the definition that we use, that I've always used in teaching entrepreneurship, is a structured process for solving problems. In fact, the tagline for the Nelson Center is solutions with impact. And you can't think of a more consequential problem for our students and our community to be focused on than this particular one. And we are thirsting for solutions that have big impact on this serious problem. In addition to this kind of event where we're sharing some information and I hope inspiring you to take action, we have other kinds of resources focused on this field available through the Nelson Center, including climate change venture grants, which will help empower you to take action. We are about to launch internships that will pay you to go work in a startup or other organization that is already focused on solutions to this consequential problem. And we're about to launch a new course in the spring on environmental entrepreneurship in conjunction with Watson. So we're very excited to be focused on this as one of the Nelson's highest priorities, and we're eager to engage you with resources that can help you do something about this problem. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society, IBES, and the Climate Solutions Lab at Watson. A specific shout out to Professor Jeff Colgan and all of his class that is joining us today, among other students from IBES and Watson and across the campus. I especially want to thank Wendy Abrams, who is a classmate of mine, a long-term friend, class of '87, and a Brown parent, for her environmental activism in general, and then more specifically for Wendy, for your generous support of Brown in many ways and of the Nelson Center in many ways, and especially for agreeing to moderate today. I think it's safe to say that the world is a better place for all of what you do, Wendy, and we really appreciate that so much of your energy is focused now on the Brown community and on our Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship. So I'll turn it over to you and leave it to you to introduce our panelists. The only other logistical thing I'll mention is that we have a relatively tight window of time. Technically, we're going to end this at around 1 o'clock to let the 1 o'clock students who have a 1 o'clock class move to their courses. But if it turns out we have some momentum and people are interested, we'll see if we can twist the arms of our panelists to stick around a little bit. Wendy, take it away.
Thank you. I want to thank Danny for having this panel, and we've been talking for a couple of years about the intersection of sustainability and entrepreneurship, and I think that it's not only that it is a subset you can focus specifically on as entrepreneurs solve problems. You know, this is a problem that needs solving, but I truly believe that every student, in order to be prepared to go in the world and succeed in the world, needs to have an understanding of climate change and where we're headed, because it is going to be such a increasingly important issue that we deal with. And if we don't deal with it, we've got a lot of problems. So I'm really honored and pleased to introduce our panel. We've just got an exceptional group of 3 guests who I think have their backgrounds really complement each other well in this panel. Wilson Hago is a scientist who, and I love the way he wrote this, with the mission of helping humanity adapt to global warming, creating technology to achieve profitable and carbon negative technologies. His company was the winner of the X Prize, the Carbon X Prize, in the phase 2 participant in the NASA CO2 conversion challenge. He volunteers as the chair of the California Los Padres section of the American Chemical Society and board member of the nonprofit organization Restore Our Climate. So thank you so much for being here, Wilson. Avi Garbow is a friend and has an amazing resume as well. Heads the environmental advocacy program at Patagonia. Prior to that, he worked as a strategic consultant and legal services to clients regarding business opportunities, investments, and operations with regard to how to address climate change. He also served in President Obama's administration. He was the longest serving general counsel in the history of the Environmental Protection Agency, and oversaw over 200 lawyers under his in his department at the EPA. So that was a huge job, and thank you for all the work you did during that administration. Rachael Miller is a Brown grad who is the founder and CEO of Cora and the founder of, I'm going to pronounce this hopefully right, Rozalia, the Rozalia Project, and a National Geographic Explorer. She's joining us from New Zealand today, so thank you for adapting your timing, your time zone to be with us. I'm gonna let you each talk a little bit more about your job, so I'm just giving you the headlines. But she invented the Cora ball for addressing the problem of marine debris. So I think that's interesting because you developed a product to address a problem. Avi, on the other hand, is working with a company, Patagonia, that is not necessarily developing products to address climate change, but has a platform and a voice within a company. So I think you're coming at it from different angles. And of course, Wilson, you're coming at it from a scientific background. So I'm interested to hear all of your insights. Before we get into the, I want to talk about your career paths and what you're doing, where you're currently working, but maybe we can give, I think this is obviously a well-educated group of people joining us, but if you guys could each give a point or two about the magnitude of the problem that we're facing and the sense of urgency, I think that that's helpful. A lot of times we talk about 2 degrees or rising sea levels, but I don't know if the general public understands, what does 2 degrees mean? Where are we compared to that? When we talk about a tipping point or having till 2030, can you translate that into a more layman's terms? And Avi, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and thanks for having me. It's really great to be with you all. Just in terms of the magnitude of the problem, I mean, I don't want to substitute certainly my voice for those of the scientists, and would encourage folks to read the National Climate Assessment that our own scientists and government officials put out every couple of years, but also, of course, the IPCC reports, which have easily digestible executive summaries with some really great information about the impacts. But I guess just two overarching thoughts, Wendy, in response to your question. One is, particularly because I focused on environmental law for so much of my career, just a reminder, one, that we've known about the science for decades. Two, it was in the 1990s that citizens and states like Massachusetts, for example, began to petition for action on climate change. And when you think about what's gone on since then, it really wasn't until our kind of time in the Obama administration that we finally, I think, took some forceful actions and ended up with Paris. And then here we are with the last 3.5 years, seeing almost all of those efforts rolled back. And so, you know, the idea that we've got an issue of climate change with the magnitude that we're dealing with, and have not been able to responsibly address it, you know, since the 90s, since these efforts were underway, really points to some enormous failures that my hope is that we can correct. The other point that I would just make is climate change is one of those environmental issues that's got an economic dimension, a national security dimension, a food security dimension, a social and environmental justice dimension, and it really impacts everybody coast to coast and all around the globe. Very, very different in many ways than a lot of the environmental issues that are more localized that we tackle. So from my perspective, you know, this is hitting everybody to varying degrees, but it's only going to get worse. And of course, if we don't start soon, we're going to reach that proverbial tipping point.
Thank you. Wilson, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the problem is huge. And then we've been putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since, the Industrial Revolution, and this has led to an excess amount in the atmosphere. And so to get back to what our stable climate for the past several million years, basically, we need to undo all of that if we want to get to that stage. And it's going to take a lot of work to basically get back. So the scale of the problem is huge.
And Rachael, any other comments?
Well, the only thing I think to add now, just that helps frame my involvement in all of this, is our focus area is marine debris, which sort of right out of the gate doesn't necessarily sound like it may fall into climate change, but there's a very large overlap, because marine debris work isn't just about cleanup, but it is also about preventing that all of our trash from getting everywhere. And if we specifically have a look at plastics, especially in packaging and things like that, that what it really is a problem related to resource use and consumption. And those topics are square in the climate change conversation. So the overlap is big, and for the marine debris portion of this, the urgency is the same, that we just are getting to the last point where our efforts really will make a very big difference, but we are still in that place.
Thank you.
Still have a chance.
Yeah, I was going to just add one analogy to that too, because I think sometimes, first of all, we talk about 2 degrees, it's 2 degrees Celsius versus, but what does that even mean? And I like to use the analogy of kind of the human body as like the world's ecosystem is similar, that if we're already 1 degree warmer than we were in a pre-industrial age. So we're highly functional, but we're not as good as we were. If we're heading towards 2 degrees, that's what the scientific community is consistently saying. This is a point which we do not want to pass if we want to kind of keep this sustainable planet that we're used to. At 3 degrees, and if you think about it too, if you have a 1 degree temperature, you probably go to work. At 2 degrees, maybe you still go to work or you work from home. At 3 or 4 degrees, you're sick, you call in sick, you take the day off. At 5 or 6 degrees, it's really critical. And at 7 degrees, it's life threatening. And I kind of think that that's where, when we talk about the Earth's warming, we should keep that in mind, because otherwise you talk about a degree, it doesn't sound like such a big deal. But when we think about it in that context, I think that gives people a little frame of reference. Okay, so I wanted to go, if each of you want to tell a little bit of, spend a couple of minutes about your career paths. How did you start? How did you get into the path that you have chosen? Did you come at it because you wanted to focus on sustainability, or is that just where it led you? And Rachael, I think yours probably, it sounds like you started with oceans. You've always had a passion for oceans, and that might have been the most obvious, but so why don't we start with you in terms of what was your path?
I think what I had was a pretty unconventional path, and I'll just give you the things that I did after Brown, including, and they all led me to Rozalia Project, but I didn't know it until I got there. So, and I scared my parents really badly along the way. So the short version is I went to Brown to study art semiotics and be on the sailing team. My academic studies evolved and wiggled around to end up as an anthropology major, but what I really studied was underwater archaeology. I got out of Brown and did an Olympic sailing campaign, but didn't make the Olympics. But I learned a lot about logistics and fundraising and all the great things that sport gives and competition. After that, I ran a community sailing center as its first director, so learned about nonprofit management, especially out of the gate. After that, started my own school to teach people how to snow kite in the winter and kite surf and windsurf in the summer. And then we were the first company in North America to use underwater robots, little ROVs, to explore shipwrecks and look at the history. And I mean, shipwrecks are really exciting. So that was in Lake Champlain. And then those two businesses, the stormboarding, the adrenaline water sports, and shipwrecks were a lesson in a fun thing does not a great business idea make. And we didn't have enough people in Vermont, and even a great product doesn't make a good business necessarily. So that was big lessons there. And it was during a reassessment where we said, okay, we get 5 years to have a business, less if it's losing money, but at 5 years, we need to make an assessment. And we were doing that. And we were on a beach off an island in Maine. There had just been a nor'easter, and we went to the little beach near a cottage that we were going to stay at for the weekend. It was covered in trash up to my knees. And it was really that moment that my husband actually had my epiphany. He said, marine debris is the one thing that really makes you angry. Let's do something about it. And Rozalia Project was born. That's a nonprofit working on marine debris. 11 years ago, that was now. And while we were doing that, we learned about microfiber pollution. We heard about that problem, and it was just a problem that screamed at us, louder even than the other parts of the marine debris problem we'd been working on. And that's how we came to invent the Cora ball. I'll show it when I'll take off my background. And so we came in a very practical, somewhat salty way to where we are now. And yeah, looking back, there were moments when I didn't really know, and my parents were like, "You're a kite surfing instructor, and that's it." But it all kind of now adds together and brought me to where I am.
Great. And Wilson, you started as a scientist. Did you go into science with the hope of addressing sustainability issues and climate change, or does?
No, not at all. It started out basically. I just always liked science way back since I was a teenager, and so I just there was kind of a natural thing just to keep going in science. Actually, I was at one point hoping to be an academic professor, but I couldn't find a job in the field, and so I went over to found a job in industry. Right after went to graduate school, and then I did a postdoc in California. And then the job that I found kind of led from one thing led to another. So and then along the way, while having a job and working for other people, I realized that you know, being an entrepreneur is better than working for other people, and then kind of executing ideas. And so that's how I kind of veered into sustainability. And I found basically this is the best problem to be in terms of being able to help humanity, kind of solving a problem, building stuff, and then helping with the climate change problem, which did not at that time seem to be getting enough attention. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. One more thing is that Rachael and myself graduated. I graduated in '94. Rachael graduated in '93. And so we are kind of 25 years away from our kind of respective graduations or so. I'd like to see people kind of this panel just basically 5 years after graduation, because we don't have the time to have climate entrepreneurs wait that long to kind of be on a panel. That's anyway.
And Avi, you've had quite an impressive career, and it spanned both law and business. And tell us how your path has taken you.
Yeah, sure. So I was always interested in environmental issues as a kid. I was immensely impressed by the Cousteau Society, and I used to, look at the undersea videos with Jacques Cousteau and imagine that would be me one day. I ended up deciding after college to go to law school. The primary impetus there was to try to use the law to advocate for the environment. I chose that school in part, the University of Virginia Law School, because they had an oceans law and science institute and program. So I ended up getting a joint law degree and then a master's in marine affairs. Still, again, thinking I might end up being in the inflatable with the blue whales. That didn't quite pan out, but I ended up going into work at the Environmental Protection Agency right out of law school. And the majority of my service was in government. It was in a variety of capacities at the EPA and then at the Justice Department as an environmental crimes prosecutor. And then a little bit of time kind of in private practice in between. And then, as you noted kind of earlier in the bio, had the wonderful opportunity and privilege to serve both terms in the Obama administration at EPA, culminating as the agency's general counsel. And then a little bit, again, time in private practice after the Obama administration, but was very fortunate to land my current role, one that they were kind enough to create for me at Patagonia. And now I really get to, in a sense, take a step back from the law and focus once again on just environmental issues, both using all of the resources that Patagonia has to advocate externally for change kind of outside of our own footprint, but also from a business standpoint to see what innovations we can kind of nurture internally and how we can be better ourselves and be corporate leaders.
Can you expand on that? That was my next question is how do you see, I think too often people think of something as an environmental issue is for the environmentalists will handle that, the NGOs, this is for other people, I'm in business. And what I hope that the students in working with the Nelson Center take away from this discussion is that not only is there an opportunity, there's potentially you can have more impact by being an entrepreneur and working within the business world to solve problems. And so what are some examples of things that Patagonia is working on and whether it's at Patagonia or other companies that you think that they've got the opportunity to really make an impact?
Well, a couple things. One, if the last almost 4 years has taught me anything, when it comes to the issue of climate change, it's that reliance on government is not going to get you anywhere. And while I firmly believe that we need strong international governmental leadership on the issue of climate change, I don't think there's a substitute for it, by the way. But in addition, we also need the private sector, which accounts for the vast majority, of course, of emissions that we need to deal with. And the private sector has the capacity, just think about the entrepreneurs you've got on the panel here, of coming up with new innovations that are, by the way, economically viable, profitable, job creating opportunities that at the same time really kind of address our climate and environmental needs. And that, I think, is one of the roles that we have at Patagonia, something that I think is important for us in the private sector. It's to figure out ways of improving, of lowering your own footprint when it comes to climate change, all of the environmental issues that are associated with it, water pollution among them, and figure out how to do it in a replicable way. Like, we could be a totally non-emitting company, and we would have very little impact on the broader problem if we weren't creating solutions that were scalable and replicable elsewhere, whether it's just in our industry sector or in other sectors. So, that, I think, is the challenge that I see for us at Patagonia and for other companies. It's to try to innovate and be that step ahead, to prove out again that it's not the environment or the economy, it's both. And in fact, it's always been both. That's not a new epiphany. And to develop things that others can seize upon and make us leaders in, again, the clean technology space. This is, I go back to a comment that I've heard Joe Biden make, certainly in his campaign, where he says, look, when Trump sees climate change, he sees a hoax. Where I, Joe Biden, see climate change, I see jobs. And for me, that's really what this issue is about. It's about the next generation of jobs and technological innovations that, when married with strong governmental policies, can really allow us to make progress.
Yep. And Wilson, how do you see, sometimes I think that the government, I agree with Ari's point that there does need to be a role for government and regulations, but in some ways also, if by developing technologies that didn't exist before, you remove the barrier of government or naysayers saying, but we can't do that. It's not cost effective, or we don't have the technology to do that. So what are you doing? I'm really intrigued also by your goal of making carbon negative technologies. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the idea of carbon negative is that you do a process, and then in the process of doing that thing, you actually bury more carbon than you started out with. So you're essentially extracting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that's kind of a carbon negative process. So for example, in what we're doing, we have a process where we take carbon dioxide from, let's say, a power plant or an industrial facility, and then in the process we make a variety of different carbons, and all of these carbons kind of wind up in the soil. So you have a way of extracting the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Actually, one of the things that I forgot to mention this thing is that you're using basic waste wood in the process. So there are a lot of other different approaches, carbon negative approaches. One of them is just you capture, for example, the carbon dioxide, let's say from air, and then you include it in concrete, and basically that's a one-way process for the carbon dioxide to go from the atmosphere to solid form and stay there for a very long time. So there are a variety of different approaches like this that need to be considered going forward in terms of addressing climate change, in terms of actually reversing the damage that we have done to the planet.
And what's the biggest barrier you face to scaling that?
Mm-hmm. Well, right now it's a very beginning field. It's a nascent field. So the barriers at the beginning is like with any other business. It takes capital just to get going. So but in particularly in like say in the chemical field where I am, it takes it's a lot of capital to get going. So the government incentives help at the beginning just to get off the ground. So there's a role for government to play in that.
Right. Yeah, what you, Rachel, do you want to talk about what you, or I'll ask everybody, but I'll let you start. As an entrepreneur, I think right now we're not, because we don't have regulations in place, at least domestically, but hopefully we will. What does it look like to operate in a carbon constrained world? And how do you plan for that?
So for us, I wasn't able, I'll show, this is the Cora ball for people who haven't seen it. And its purpose is to collect microfiber before it can wash out the washing machine. So I just wanted to clarify, if people haven't had a look, you can check it out online for more information about the problem. And anyone who wants to talk about microplastic or that, definitely catch me later for that part.
Well, let me interject. I'm sorry, because you brought that up. Do you want to take a minute and tell about how you, did you design it yourself? Did you hire engineers? How did you assemble the team to come up with that product? Once you said, here's what I want to do, then how did you figure out how to do it?
Right, we learned about, we didn't discover the problem, we learned about it. Like I said, it screamed at us. We recognized it was going to be such a big problem for the ocean. And so we set about trying to figure out, okay, what can we do? And we just started to think about the problem. And we came up with and rejected several ideas that had to do, we rejected them because it would take too long to implement, like washing machine filters. That is the way I believe this needs to go. Ultimately, along with making clothes more resilient, a place in which we have no expertise. And we eventually came up with something in the washing machine. We didn't want it to interfere with, there were lots of criteria. We don't need to go into the details of the criteria. And it was actually myself, my co-founder, also my husband, and an intern who was working for us. This is a classic story of internships leading to permanent jobs. As Brooke Winslow, she ended up on our inventor team as the technical person. And I think what's interesting about our team is our complementary roles. So my husband is a big thinker, right brain dominant, sees patterns in the world that other people have a hard time seeing. He comes up with the big ideas. Brooke is our technical designer. She made it look super cool. She took his drawings and his words and turned them through the computer into 3D printed models and prototypes for us to test. And I'm the sort of mechanical problem solver and communicator. So our first ideas didn't work at all. We ended up using biomimicry to come up with the Cora ball. Our first ideas really didn't work, and we thought, like, what needs to happen? And what needs to happen for us is we need to catch small things from moving water. And coral catches small things from moving water. And it was that moment that switched our design thinking and sort of progress to come up with something that we were willing to launch. For us, we wanted a minimum of 10% efficiency, ideally more, but that was our minimum. And yeah, so that's kind of the team. We used outside help for understanding materials eventually. We also had grant funding. It was born out of a nonprofit, but then we brought it out of the nonprofit and started with Kickstarter. And we got some help in communication with our Kickstarter campaign. But as far as the inventing process, we were lucky to have this very complementary but non-overlapping small group.
Great. Avi, what do you think is the most meaningful shift within industry that you've seen in regard to combating climate change?
Well, I'll tell you a shift that I see starting to happen, which I think will be the most meaningful, and that's taking responsibility for one's supply chain. It's all too easy, certainly in the United States, for us to worry about what are called scope 1 and 2 emissions and not accept responsibility, if you will, for the pollution, including the carbon pollution that's associated with our businesses' supply chains, many of which, of course, are overseas, creating not just kind of localized environmental issues there, which have a social dimension, but also contributing to our global climate change problem. So for me, it's the increasing number of companies that are starting to realize, for any number of reasons, that they have to be part of the full suite of solutions, if you will, for all of their scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That, by the way, I think is amongst our greatest challenges. It's very, I should say, it is relatively easy to address, your emissions portfolios here, sometimes in the States, not always easy, dependent on the industrial sector. But really expanding, I think, your reach and scope of responsibility is where I see things heading kind of corporate wise. And I think that's a good direction to head in.
Can I add something to that?
Of course.
I had also written supply chain really big earlier in the discussion. And when you asked about the carbon constrained world, for Cora, it's been really fascinating coming from conservation into essentially manufacturing, certainly eye-opening. And it's in the supply chain that I know I've learned the most. And conservation and footprint has guided really all of our decisions. And I think that's a place where, whether you're a very small company like ours or a very large, medium, large company, there's a lot of impact to be had. Little things on our part where we decided just to make the product in the US from US, everything, the material were manufactured in Vermont, were fulfilled from Vermont. We figured out how to do co-shipping. So there's a truck already moving between our 2 locations, and they even bring our manufacturing packaging back. So we have 0 waste between manufacturing and assembly, and thinking about packaging a lot and really hard as well. And I think that's something that as people move into innovating things or developing products that need to be made, that the supply chain is a particularly powerful place to have an impact.
Mm-hmm. Short of government regulation, which hopefully will be sooner rather than later, because I think once you put that in place, everybody needs to comply with the rules. But right now, do you think that it's companies responding? Where's the balance between companies responding to social demand for sustainable products, or what role can companies play in creating social demand for more sustainability? I think Patagonia, I think, is one of the great examples of a company that not only makes the products, but reinforces the need for that, and turning up the volume on the voice for sustainable action in society. But, how do you see companies, again, being reactive or proactive?
I guess I don't think companies need to create the demand. I think consumers need to demand the change. And the fact is that companies will react to what the consumers are willing to purchase and pay for, and the more that people, as we say, vote with their pockets and make smart decisions based on, I think, sound environmental and climate change factors, the more you'll see companies make the required change. And the same goes not just for consumers, but for investors. I mean, the more that finance and investment in companies is tied not just to financial profitability, but also to social and environmental good, when we start to expand, who we think are the genuine or the true stakeholders for a company, that's, I think, when we're going to see real change at the company place. So there'll be a number of companies, I think Patagonia is amongst them, who will probably try to do the right thing irrespective of what the consumers are demanding. But the vast majority of companies are going to react to what the market wants. And I think we need to begin the process of educating consumers to demand the changes that are fully within the realm of possibility at companies.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I can add something, to what Abby had just mentioned. Yeah, I think should be this greater awareness of what a carbon footprint is for anything. I mean, on an individual level, if I kind of turn on the lights, what is my carbon footprint? If I drive 50 miles, what is the carbon footprint? Or if I use a certain product, or if I kind of have a cup, and then what is the energy that gone in there? How much carbon have I produced in the process? So that applies to an individual level, but it also applies for companies, right? What is the carbon footprint that ultimately the company has used how much carbon has the company generated in order to make a product? So if individuals become aware of this idea, and then they start insisting that products that are made with as low a carbon footprint as possible, then I think we'll see more of a change at the societal level. And that's starting to happen. I mean, you look at Amazon and putting an order for 100,000 trucks, right? Electric trucks. So that's.
And Wilson, are people coming to you to say, help us reduce our carbon footprint, or are you going to potential clients, and saying, here's what we could do in terms of helping you take CO2 out of your
product? It's the latter. So our proposition is that we can provide offsets to you and then and lower your carbon footprint that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I've got a lot more questions, but Abby, I want to leave time for students and other people in the audience to ask questions as well. So I don't know if you want to chime in with some of if people have questions on the call.
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and answer Serafina's question. I'll click answer live. Do you think it's up to big businesses to take the first step necessary to combat climate change, or do you think it's up to the little everyday people or individuals? Was her question.
Well,
I would say just both. I mean, it's just it requires every single individual. I mean, if we're going to tackle this problem, it's going to require all our efforts.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, I think it's you're doomed to fail in solving big problems if you're always kind of wait for somebody else to take that first step. There's a wonderful quote that's, I'm sure it's appeared many places. It also appears in Yvonne Chouinard's "Let My People Go Surfing" book, which I would recommend to many folks in terms of kind of a business philosophy to at least learn about at Patagonia. But it's a quote that's attributed to an unnamed Native American medicine man who says, we are the people we've been waiting for. That's the mantra I think people need to ask themselves or think about when confronting problems like this. It's not somebody else's problem. It's all of our problems.
Great.
And I'll just echo that. And something that's particularly easy to grasp when looking at, say, something like microplastic is the concept that lots of littles make a big. So lots of little tiny problems can add up to a big problem, but lots of little efforts can also add up to big impact.
There's another question from Shauna for Wilson. She says, Wilson, when you mentioned about carbon sequestration in concrete sounds really interesting. Could you talk more about what that is, and if something the industry is doing right now?
Yeah, so the idea is basically, what can you do? How can you recycle the carbon dioxide that you capture, or how can you incorporate it into a variety of products? So anything that you use, like say shoes or what have you, how can you capture the carbon dioxide that you've captured? How can you then either chemically change it, or just take it as is and incorporate it into products? So that's a big kind of I should say a beginning industry that needs more help to get going, but it's beginning, and there are entrepreneurs here and there working on that problem. So there, carbon dioxide, I mean, it's basically a waste product today, and there's no cost associated with making it. If you look at carbon prices throughout the world, some of them, they are either no prices or they're obscenely low. So there's basically no incentive for people to do anything with the carbon dioxide. Going forward, entrepreneurs kind of look into the future and say, well, this is going to change. Either we change this or nature will change it for us. So we need to find ways in terms of thinking along these ways of how do we recycle the world's biggest waste. And that's kind of the problem. And then some ideas are, okay, let's do something, let's incorporate it into concrete. So make it's the way it's incorporated into concrete is that carbon dioxide is made into calcium carbonate, and that's kind of an ingredient in the concrete. So thinking along those lines is what the idea behind that.
What can I ask a question also as advice for the students? How would you, if they're not environmental science majors, let's say you're in the Nelson Center and you're studying marketing and business and Engine 9, and but what's your advice for collaborating with others in order to identify the problem, right? If an entrepreneur is a problem solver who brings solutions to market, what's the best way to go about identifying, Rachael, that came to you in your own personal life, seeing the waste wash up on the shore. But if just a student is like, well, I want to be a successful entrepreneur, but I'd like to solve a problem here too. How do you identify, should they be working with environmental science students? Should they be working with chemists? What's the best way to go about even finding that niche that you want to address?
I'll start with that. I think there does need to be some sort of first a little bit of direction pointing in terms of personal motivation. So even if you don't stumble onto a dirty beach, there'll be problems that scream at you or maybe whisper loudly. And those are places to start. And then once you start kind of looking into those broader categories, I think finding the specific problems in there becomes easier as you start to talk to a broad variety of people working on the problem, from people in on the business side, from people on the NGO side, from people on the regulation policy side. As soon as you start talking to people in that category, you'll find the problems that need solving, and even looking at this incredible opportunities in contests. Like Wilson won an X Prize, and there's a fair amount of that going on. There are motivated people who are putting up a lot of support to inspire solutions, and that's another place to understand what the problems are, by seeing where that support is being offered.
Oh, exactly. I didn't win the X Prize. This is correct. I was a semifinalist in the X Prize. But going to the this idea, how can I contribute? I mean, it's just this problem is so huge that there's you can basically, somebody should just look at there and saying, what are my talents, and how can then I incorporate these talents into the climate change problem? And there will be no dearth of basically places where where that can happen. So if you want to work in this field, it's possible to enter it from a variety of different points, not necessarily engineering or scientific.
There's a question for you, Avi, from Shauna that said, in terms of private and public sector funding, do you think there are any ideas that the US can borrow from, say, China, where the government invests heavily in clean tech?
Not sure that we need to borrow the idea from anybody. We just need to do it. I mean, we all know that research and development is critical. Government is not the only source of that of those funds, but it's certainly an important source of it. There's talk about an ARPA, right, Advanced Research Projects Agency at the Department of Energy. There's talk about creating an ARPA at Ag to talk about sustainable agricultural practices. So I think we just need to do the obvious, which is to invest in research, invest in development, and help innovators. Now, just when it comes to China, I mean, one critical point, or at least a critical one for me, is that because, of course, of their system, their political system, they are able to direct resources in ways and with a degree of speed that we in this country are unable to do. But at the same time, as much as they are, I think, making a lot of advances, one of the things that I hope that China refrains from continuing to do, which is to not just export the good technologies, but finance coal projects elsewhere in parts of the developing world. So, I just thought it would be kind of interesting to mention that at the same time that they're spending heavily, I believe, on low carbon technologies, they're also certainly in the mix when it comes to financing some heavy carbon outputs elsewhere. But long and short is we don't need to learn it from anybody. We just need to do it. And I think some of the political candidates, shall we say, have plans to do just that.
Great. Yeah, on the topic of politics, I'll take a stab at this one, but you guys, I welcome you to chime in. The question is, why is climate change politicized? If politics are highly influenced by industries such as oil and gas, why can't there be equally matched climate lobby for renewables? I would just say that the incumbents have a lot more, they're bigger industries. There are literally trillions of dollars at stake of assets. I believe it was Bill McKibben that said there's about $26 trillion worth of oil and gas that is on the books of oil and gas companies that have not been dug up yet. We also cannot burn that much oil and gas or we will live in an uninhabitable planet. So those things are at odds, but they have a tremendous amount of assets that they have already, at stake. So to spend $1 billion, and they don't even need to spend that much in terms of lobbying, there's a huge return on investment. I think the other industries just don't have the infrastructure. They're just smaller, more fledgling industries. But do you have an insight on that, Avi, coming from government?
I guess my only comment is I think the goal is not to increase necessarily the lobbying power of the renewable industry and have them match the tremendous and grotesque infusion of money into the process. It would, I would suggest, should be the opposite, which is to diminish the power of lobbyists in general, including, of course, all of the money that's spent by the fossil fuel industry, and let science drive and answer our problems.
Right. I agree. Wilson, do you think that there's a role for government to require carbon footprint labeling? And as a non-scientist, is measuring carbon footprint relatively easy and straightforward?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think it's a cool idea to have a labeling, carbon footprint labeling for any product. And I think I've heard of certain countries in Europe doing that as a matter of course. But it certainly, I think, will be helpful for people to kind of, when if they go to a retail store, just to be able to see the carbon footprint, so they can make smart decisions about whether they want to keep promote certain types of businesses. So I'm sorry, the second half of the question was?
Is it relatively easy to measure carbon footprint?
There's a technique in the field called life cycle analysis that's practiced by scientists, and so that's more or less fairly straightforward, so that can be incorporated into the labeling.
We've got a question from Annika. What are some of the steps, what are some steps consumers like us can do to demand change from the companies they buy products from? Rachel, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so for this one, I think there's two ways. One is vote with your wallet, straight up. Do a little bit of research, buy what you need, but also from companies that are taking actions that essentially you approve of. And if they are not sharing what they are doing, then shift. But I think there needs to be another part to that. So, and that would be communicating with companies, ideally in a way that is specific and constructive, rather than just sort of just emotional, so that the companies have the opportunity to change or to keep doing what they're doing that is sort of working from a footprint and from all the angles. So, I think that there's a two-part problem. Looking very specifically at microfiber, it's very interesting. There's a crossover, in fact, with Patagonia. Patagonia front-footed this problem from a corporate standpoint. It was spectacular. And in the interest of full disclosure, Rozalia project has been supported by Patagonia, and we're big fans. So just want to say that. So Patagonia front-footed the problem. They they had research done, they talked about it, and they sort of took some action, which is spectacular. So the washing machine industry has kept fairly quiet. Now it's just as complicated a solution or suite of solutions that they're going to need, but they've really kept quiet. And I think it's because people communicated with the apparel industry at large, but especially outdoor apparel. And people have not been specifically communicating with the washing machine industry. You know, it sounds funny to even say that out loud, but that will be important to speed up the solution, one of the solutions that is going to have a big impact. And so I think vote with your wallet, one, but then communicate in a specific and constructive way so the companies understand what you're after.
And on that note, I know some people are going to have to jump on timing. We can, if the panelists can stick around, we can try to answer a few more questions. One question was about how consumers can affect change. And one thing I would also recommend to the Brown students, you know, you're coming out of, I'm a little bit biased, but you're coming out of one of the best universities in the country, and you're probably being recruited by some top companies. And I think when you're being recruited or in job interviews, you can ask the question, what is your company doing about sustainability or climate change? And just by virtue of asking that question, hopefully they have a good answer. And if they don't, I'm guessing that employee is going to go back to their headquarters and say, geez, I got, you know, wow, I was at Brown today and embarrassed that we don't have a sustainability plan, or you don't take that job because we're being turned down by students because, you know, we're not forward thinking enough. So I think you've got power in asking, you know, in asking questions to companies because you're going to interface with them as students. So Danny or Abby, do we have, can we keep going with asking some questions?
I think Danny had a couple announcements to make.
Okay.
And then we can go back to questions. If that sounds good.
Yeah, I'm going to encourage people to stick around. We have quite a few people who are here, and we should continue for a little while longer, I suspect. I want to end where we started, which is to thank everybody. This doesn't happen on its own. And especially the panelists and Wendy for all of your expertise and enthusiasm and commitment to this focused effort. This is, as I said, I don't have to emphasize this, perhaps the most consequential problem that we as a Brown community, we as a Nelson Center community can be thinking through. And I love all the back and forth and the questions. There's clearly a lot of interest. I will advertise a bit just to say that if you liked what you heard today, there's a lot more to be had accessible through the Nelson Center website. All the kind of resources I mentioned before, the course that'll be launched in the spring, the grants, the internships. And I also detect there's been some typing to answer questions, but if we didn't do that well enough, we will take note of all the questions, and perhaps we'll be able to do that asynchronously, post something with answers from our esteemed panelists. The other thing I'd like to do is just to say that if you registered for today, we will put you on our email updates, and you'll be invited to come to more of events like these. Our next Founder Friday is on November 13th, and it'll be focused on the topic of leading and navigating startups during uncertainty. And there's uncertainty about leading any kind of startup, but needless to say, what we're engaged in right now infuses quite a bit more. So I encourage you all to register for that. And even between now and then, there is a ton of activity going on. All of the Nelson Center events are being held remotely. We haven't skipped a beat. We're doing even more this semester than ever before. And so we encourage you to participate in any way that you might like. Curricularly in the classroom, co-curricularly like this kind of learning opportunity. And if we can empower you through venture support resources, we will definitely do that. So I'll turn it back over to Wendy, and we'll spend a couple more minutes. I would just say eyeball the number of people on the participants icon, and if it dips below a certain threshold, maybe we'll wrap up, but maybe take 5-ish more minutes to answer a couple more questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you again for having us. Okay, there's a question from Amina. how can people in lesser developed countries work towards sustainability? Do you want to take that? One thing I might say, you guys, sorry. In some way, there's always the argument that, you know, other countries want to raise their standard of living to what the United States is, and how can we impose restrictions on other people, particularly they haven't had the century that we've had to get to where we are in terms of a standard of living of comfort. But one thing I would say is there's also the opportunity to kind of leapfrog technologies, right? You don't have to make the mistakes that we have made in the United States, where, you know, building an infrastructure of pipelines and coal plants, and they can, you know, if you're in an undeveloped, where the energy infrastructure isn't as developed, you can, you know, move to the next technology without. It's kind of like if you didn't have phone lines, don't bother building landlines, just go to cell phones. So I think there's an opportunity there as well. And in some ways we are at it's harder to transition in the United States because there's so much fixed cost in things like pipelines or other infrastructure. But you guys have something to add?
Yeah, if I may, yeah, I mean, the developing world doesn't have to follow in the same trajectory as the developed world. And for example, they don't need to build more coal power plants just to pollute the planet. And the question is, how can they do that? So they need to just go directly to renewable energies. One of the things I've been looking at, actually with a Brown intern, whose name is Mariko Kishimoto, is to how do we get microgrids installed in the developing world, and do that basically in villages that are off the grid, and how can we do this in a profitable way? And so there's ideas like that.
Avi, you mentioned agriculture. Could you want to be a little more specific about what you think the opportunities are for changes, whether it be research or just implementing current technologies in agriculture?
Yeah, so you know, agriculture is both a huge contributor to carbon pollution, but it's also presents in many ways unique opportunities to be part of the solution. So one, on the contribution side, you know, it's a lot of the fossil fuel inputs, the nitrogen fertilizers, things like that are intense greenhouse gas contributors. And so one, we need to figure out ways of lowering those synthetic inputs that have greenhouse gas implications. But at the same time, we need to look at ways of nurturing more natural climate solutions. So our soils and our forests and our grasslands, for that matter, all have enormous and in many ways untapped potential to store large amounts of carbon for long periods of time. So at Patagonia, for example, we've long been on the organic agricultural train, and I serve on the Organic Trade Association's board of directors. But more importantly, a couple years ago, Patagonia and some other brands like Dr. Bronner's contributed to the founding of something called the Regenerative Organic Alliance, which itself has stood up a new regenerative organic certification just this summer. Again, marrying, I think, the carbon-related benefits of organic farming with the regenerative practices that can have great societal benefits too. Many folks probably don't know, Wendy, that Patagonia also has a food business called Patagonia Provisions. And so, you know, part of what we're about is having a positive impact on a transformation like in agriculture that really can make quite a difference for our climate and our communities.
Great. Mandy asked, how effective do you think electric cars really are in combating climate change? And are they a sustainable or even realistic alternative? Wilson, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, they're better than the competition, because California is actually banning fossil fuel powered cars within, I think, in a few decades. So they're effective. I mean, what you do with electric cars is that you're shifting the production from from a local source, from the car itself to the power plant. So ultimately, you have to change the power, how the power plant can emit so that it doesn't emit. And so they just entirely, the power plant uses renewable energy, wind, solar, hydro, whatever. So that's you have to recognize that that must be done in conjunction with electrification of everything.
Great. There's a question for Avi. How effective do you think carbon taxes are as a long-term solution to climate change? And how effective do you think New York City's new Green New Deal plan is going to be?
So on the first question, I know there are many economists that will model out any number of carbon tax plans and suggest that we'll get the kind of reductions we need. From my vantage point, there are a couple of prerequisites when I examine any carbon tax plan. One is that the dollar amount per ton is sufficiently high to have somewhat immediate impact. And you'll see ranges from $15 a ton up until, to 40 and higher. So I think, and I think the IPCC would suggest that it's really got to be in the $50+ range to have any immediate impact. But two other criteria are important to me. One, I do not see a carbon tax as a complete substitute for everything else that government can do to limit carbon emissions. And a lot of the carbon pricing plans would effectively take away EPA's authority to regulate carbon pollution and other regulatory approaches in lieu of the carbon pricing. And I guess the final and perhaps most important point is that we need to ensure that that a carbon tax is not regressive, that it doesn't create more harm than good for those in low-income and minority communities who can least afford it. And there are ways to figure out kind of where that revenue goes. It can go back into distressed communities. It can go back into renewable research and development. But where the revenue goes is a key part of that. As to the New York Green New Deal, I really don't know the details about it. I know some of the folks that are up there working on it, but it would be wrong for me to comment other than to wish them best. And I hope they can meet their aggressive targets.
Great. Great. Nora asked a question. How do you see your role with the climate movement and what do you hope for it in the future? What is your advice for younger generation trying to incorporate different perspectives within climate justice and action against climate change? Rachel, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So our role with Rozalia Project, our nonprofit, and the Cora Ball is on the side of resource use and consumption and moving towards a circular economy, I would say in a sort of specific, broad way. And my advice is go for it, get into it. And that something that we believe in very, very deeply is the need for what over at MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative, one of the groups we work with, they call radical interdisciplinarity. And to me, what that means is we need people from all different backgrounds, industries, artists, communicators, scientists, and all different scientific disciplines and policy people. There's a lot of opportunity to make an impact. And so I would encourage people not to think in single tracks or to think that their own areas of expertise that there aren't opportunities for you. There are likely spectacular opportunities. And it just depends on which sort of sector of the problem that you want to work on.
Okay, great. There's a question. As a consumer, how can one distinguish greenwashing from actual effort?
I'll take a crack at that. I think, Rachel, I believe, was the one that suggested this earlier. Somebody did, maybe it was you, Wendy. You need to ask questions, right? You need to, most companies will post reports. You need to demand some degree of transparency. I think that's really important. You need to kind of look behind the label, but I will concede that it's not always easy. And there's a lot of misinformation or partial information out there, and kind of there's no perfect way of, I think, detecting you know, what I'll say, forgive me, the bullshit meter on a lot of these claims, but asking questions and become educated is the best you can do. I don't think you can expect to have a perfect record on that front.
I would also say to people who care about demanding transparency and sustainability from corporations, to express that to the corporations, whether it be through your purchasing power or even in social media. But I also think it's important to applaud companies when they do the right thing. Again, both by buying their products, but to the extent, again, we live in such a world of social media and influencers where consumers can have tremendous power just by innate virtue of your social media or your network. And to the extent that you can amplify what you know, Patagonia did this, how great is that? Or I just bought a Cora ball and look what I, people don't know about it. And I think the idea that the more corporations are applauded for even taking baby steps, the more initiatives they will want to take on and have a little more enthusiasm to doing that a little bit faster. So
yeah, Wendy, I just want to completely second that and advocate for specificity. So when you go to say something positive or negative, to be very specific about it, because it's hard to learn from this is awesome or this sucks. That those are not constructive and no one learns anything. But if you can say very specifically why something is awesome, that this is the effort they made, it is made from this renewable resource, or this, I asked a question and didn't get an answer, this was the question, this was the answer, that kind of a thing, that level of specificity, I think, is what actually really starts to make some changes, because it's instructive rather than a kind of an educational dead end.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if I add something, yeah, if I mean, to young people who are kind of getting their first job, right? The first thing I would ask, as you have suggested, Wendy, is basically, what is your sustainability plan? And if there is none, then just say, okay, I am your corporate sustainability officer right now, and I'm going to do whatever I can to bring you in compliance.
Are there resources within the fields that each of you work in that you think are would be helpful in terms of whether you're in a company or a student and you want to kind of learn best practices? Avi, you mentioned that my people go surfing, might be a philosophy, but are there even more specifics in terms of just where would you recommend that students, let's say you're presenting your business plan to the B Lab and you want to incorporate more layers of sustainability, where might you go to find some examples that aren't necessarily, and I think people think about what energy source do I use, and some of those are more obvious, some of them are less obvious. I'll give one example. UPS change their routing to avoid left turns so that the trucks don't idle at an intersection, which saves time but saves an enormous amount of gas and economic savings to the company. So little things like that. I don't know if you have suggestions in terms of where to find what other people are doing.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say I really don't. So I'll defer to you for sure.
Yeah, so on the sort of marine debris side and waste management, so even bigger than the stuff that's already trash in the ocean, but before it gets there, there's some good resources. So there's the NOAA Marine Debris Program. They support lots, there's a lot there. There's the Ellen MacArthur Foundation out of the UK, but they work globally. The Trash Free Seas Alliance is a group of which we are a part, hosted by the Ocean Conservancy, and Coke and Pepsi and conservation organizations and scientists are involved with that. It's pretty fascinating. They produced, or we produced a plastics policy playbook, among other big initiatives. And I just wanted to also note that this isn't necessarily all about things. You know, we did make a thing, but it's not all about that. And there's some interesting strategies around capital and finance and creative processes in the economic world. And there's a couple resources there. One group's called Circulate Capital and the Circulate Initiative. But I could be, people want to talk very specifically on resource and marine debris and that kind of thing. I'd be happy to talk one-on-one.
You brought up the word investment, and Avi, you mentioned in your earlier resume, you were advising companies on investment strategies as well. What sort of things were you advising?
Well, in my work and over the span of my career, that period of time was relatively limited. You know, there are two things. One, you can advise companies where are the good opportunities for the investments. The other thing, which is a lot of companies are interested in hearing, is where are the risks, and that goes back to, I think, one of the key aspects of climate change is that they present enormous risks to businesses, and understanding both the upside, the companies that are positioned to take advantage of innovations and opportunities to address the problem, but also understanding, you know, what industries, what businesses, you know, stand to lose. I mean, for example, if somebody were coming to me and asking for advice as to whether to invest in an oil and gas operation, I probably would have a lot to say, not just on the upside, but a lot on the downside to that. So, you know, money needs to go, I think, to propel solutions and to depress problems.
Mm-hmm. I think the insurance industry is somewhat rather underutilized in this conversation, is for, you know, for companies that have such expertise in predicting certainly things like sea level rise or storm frequency and intensity, and have some sophisticated modeling. Why do you think that maybe companies know that on an individual basis, but I feel like that their voice has been, could be louder in the national conversation in terms of, you know, again, because this topic has been so politicized, and I believe it's been politicized because when it's fact versus fiction, science wins 100-0. When it's Democrats versus Republicans, it's 52-48 or 48-52, and it's a, you know, basically a split, and there's a tug. So the oil and gas industries want it to be political and not about fact and science. But I think an industry like the insurance industry is science-based and modeling, and yet, you know, we don't hear about it quite so much in the business industry, you know, in the national conversation. And I think that might be something, certainly as a business person, I'd like to know, you know, I know, like, we've got a warehouse in Louisiana. We can't get, you know, we can't get insurance on it for storms because it's just, nobody will sell it. I think there's, you know, you can't get coastal property insurance in Florida. Insurance, it's hard to get. So I think some of those are indicators. And as a business person, you might want to, you know those facts certainly for your own business model. But again, and I think as activists, we could try to echo that and amplify those numbers and those findings in our discussions too. So, okay, I think we're wrapping up. I don't know, Danny or Abby, do you want to take the last question?
Sure. Let's wrap it up with this one question. I know even a couple of our panelists have to leave in a second, so I think that's a good place to end. Why don't you pose one more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, yeah, first of all, I also want to echo thank you guys so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And I know everybody else on the call is as well. What's your one piece of advice for the students, what's your best piece of advice to make the biggest impact in the future?
My biggest advice is basically to make sure you're doing something that you are passionate about or that you care about. And in my own career trajectory, I've certainly found places where I was very good at doing something, but didn't care as much about it. And it was really only when you have the good fortune to combine what you're good at with what you care about that I think you'll be most rewarded. So my hope is that most of the young folks here are able to find that happy marriage sooner rather than later.
Yeah, my advice is basically find a goal that you're passionate about, that you think your life is worth living for, and then just go for it and ask yourself, what skills do I need in order to get there, and just go for it. And then the younger you start doing this, the better. It's better to do this when you're broke just out of school.
Mm-hmm.
And I completely agree with what was just said. So I'll go with sort of next one. So this is just advice that I had to learn, but I believe now it's sort of best summed up by Tinker Hatfield, the guy who designed Air Jordans. He said something along the lines of, if people don't love or hate your work, you haven't done very much. And I think that is something to keep in mind just as much. So yes, we all strive for love, but moving people is a good thing. And if you're coming from a place of passion and making decisions that do better for our planet or the people in it, then getting a little bit of pushback isn't the worst thing. It means that you are actually inspiring people in both directions. Hopefully the percentage leans towards the love side though.
Great. Great. Well, Danny, thank you for hosting us. This has really been fun, and I appreciate your spreading the gospel.
As do we, and we appreciate all of you being here. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to all the attendees. I mean, just as evidence from how many people stuck around, there's clearly a lot of passion and interest, a lot of back and forth in the Q&A, answering questions. If we didn't get to your question, we may try to answer it asynchronously. And stay tuned for all the other events we have through the Nelson Center at entrepreneurship.brown.edu. Thank you, everyone.